History remembers the Duke of Ashbourne as a ruthless titan of industry, a man who bent the Victorian aristocracy to his will with nothing but cold, hard steel and limitless wealth. But behind the closed doors of his ancestral estate lies a fiercely guarded secret, a scandal of blackmail, betrayal, and a marriage contract written in blood and debt. Lady Beatrice Somerset was a prize won in a ledger, a bride purchased to settle her father's catastrophic ruin. On their wedding night, she swore she would rather die than surrender her heart to the monster who bought her. She underestimated him, and he completely underestimated her. The year was 1868, a time when London was choking on the soot of the Industrial Revolution, while its aristocrats danced in the glittering, gas-lit ballrooms of Mayfair, pretending the world wasn't changing. Lady Beatrice Somerset stood at the window of her family's Grosvenor Square townhouse, watching the rain wash the cobblestones. At 21, she possessed the delicate porcelain beauty expected of an earl's daughter, but beneath her corseted ribs beat the heart of a caged falcon. Her father, Lord Henry Somerset, the Earl of Westmoreland, was a man whose pedigree was as ancient as his gambling addiction was severe. For years, Beatrice had watched the family estate bleed out, piece by piece. First went the summer home in Bath, then the ancestral silver, but she never knew the true extent of the devastation until the rainy afternoon, a sleek, black carriage bearing the crest of the Duke of Ashbourne pulled up to their door. Alexander Montgomery, the Duke of Ashbourne, was not a man of old, respectable money. Though he held a title inherited from a distant, childless uncle, his vast fortune was self-made, forged in the ironworks of the North and the brutal shipping lanes of the East India trade. He was 32, notoriously merciless, and despised by the traditional ton, who whispered that he smelled of coal smoke rather than cologne. Yet, they all bowed to him, because Alexander Montgomery owned half their debts. When Beatrice was summoned to her father's study, she found the Earl pale, trembling, and pouring his third glass of brandy. Sitting opposite him, looking entirely too large for the delicate velvet armchair, was the Duke. Alexander was striking, with sharp, predatory features, eyes the color of a winter sea, and a stillness about him that made the air in the room feel suffocatingly thin. "Beatrice," her father stammered, unable to meet her gaze. "His Grace has come with a proposal." Alexander stood, his imposing frame dominating the dimly lit room. He did not offer a polite bow. He simply handed Beatrice a thick sheaf of legal documents, bearing the stamp of the royal courts of justice. "Your father," Alexander said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that sent a shiver down her spine, "owes the sum of £150,000 to a syndicate of lenders. By tomorrow morning, the creditors will seize this house, your country estate, and throw the Earl into the Fleet debtors' prison. He will die there, disgraced and penniless." Beatrice stared at the papers, her vision blurring as the numbers danced maliciously on the parchment. It was an impossible sum, a death sentence. "However," Alexander continued, stepping closer, bringing with him the faint, masculine scent of sandalwood and rain, "I have purchased those notes. The debt is now mine. And I am willing to forgive it entirely, establish a comfortable annuity for your father, and secure the Somerset legacy. On one condition." Beatrice looked up, her jaw set, fighting the terror rising in her throat. "And what is the price of an earl's life, Your Grace?" "You," he said simply. "You will marry me by the end of the month." The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice looked at her father, waiting for his outrage, waiting for him to throw this arrogant upstart out into the street. But Lord Henry only looked at the floor, a broken man. He had sold her. "Why?" Beatrice demanded, turning her fierce gaze back to the Duke. "You could have any woman in England. Why buy a bride who despises you?" "Because, Lady Beatrice, I have conquered the docks, the railways, and the banks," Alexander replied, his expression unreadable. "But the House of Lords still views me as a northern savage." I require a wife of impeccable, unblemished, aristocratic blood to legitimize my presence among them. I do not want love. I do not want romance. I want a partnership of convenience. You will give me the respectability of the Somerset name, and I will give you the protection of the Ashbourne wealth. Beatrice lifted her chin, her pride the only thing keeping her knees from buckling. You may purchase my hand, your grace. You may chain me to your side to parade in front of the Queen. But hear me now. You will never have my heart. I swear to you, I will never love the man who blackmailed my family. A flicker of something amusement, sorrow, passed through Alexander's icy eyes before his mask slammed back into place. Keep your heart, madam. I have no use for it. Just keep your vows. 3 weeks later, they were married in a cold, hollow ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square. Beatrice wore a gown of heavy ivory silk that felt more like a shroud than a wedding dress. As Alexander slid the heavy, square-cut sapphire ring onto her finger, his touch was unexpectedly warm, contrasting sharply with the freezing vow he whispered for her ears alone. I will never demand from you what you are not willing to give. We are bound by law, Beatrice, not by souls. The Ashbourne estate, Blackwood Hall No, the Montgomery estate of Rookwood Manor in the sweeping, desolate moors of Yorkshire, was a fortress of dark stone and breathtaking, austere beauty. It was a stark contrast to the lively, gossipy drawing rooms of London. Here, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the halls were filled with an army of silent, efficient servants who clearly worshipped the ground their duke walked upon. Beatrice anticipated a life of miserable confinement, expecting Alexander to lock her away like a prized porcelain doll. Instead, she found herself completely abandoned to her own devices. Alexander left for his mills and shipping offices before dawn, and rarely returned before midnight. They lived parallel lives in the massive house, eating at opposite ends of a dining table so long they practically had to shout to be heard. Determined not to be broken, Beatrice refused to play the victim. She rejected the lavish allowance Alexander deposited into her accounts, wearing her pre-marriage gowns and strictly managing the household with an iron grip, much to the surprise of the formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins. Beatrice began riding out onto the moors, finding solace in the wild, untamed landscape that mirrored her own internal storm. But the isolation could not last. 6 months into their marriage, the London season demanded their presence. Alexander relocated them to his newly purchased, palatial residence on Park Lane. It was time for the Duke to parade his newly acquired aristocratic prize. Society was ruthless. The tons smiled to their faces, drank their champagne, and whispered poison behind their fans. Beatrice's own cousin, Lady Clara Wentworth, a woman who had long harbored ambitions of marrying Alexander's vast fortune, despite his lack of pedigree, was the chief architect of the Whispers. During a spectacular ball hosted by the Duke of Wellington, Beatrice found herself cornered in the conservatory by Clara and Lord Benedict Hastings, a notorious rake and a man who had a long, bitter history of business disputes with Alexander. It is such a tragedy, darling, Clara purred, her eyes glittering with malice as she looked Beatrice up and down. To see a Somerset reduced to playing the dutiful wife to a coalmonger. Tell me, does he make you balance his ledgers in bed? Lord Hastings laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. One can only imagine the horrors of a purchased marriage. I hear he barely looks at her. Perhaps the Duke prefers the company of his northern factory girls. They are, after all, more suited to his crude tastes. Beatrice felt the heat of humiliation flush her cheeks. She opened her mouth to deliver a scathing retort, but before she could speak, the temperature in the conservatory seemed to drop 10 degrees. I find, Hastings, that a man who squandered his inheritance on French actresses and bad racehorses should be very careful when discussing matters of taste. Alexander materialized from the shadows of the ferns, his presence commanding absolute silence. He was dressed impeccably in stark black evening wear, his eyes fixed on Hastings with the lethal intensity of a predator about to strike. Hastings paled, taking a reflexive step back. Ashbourne, we were merely— I know exactly what you were, Alexander interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. He stepped past Clara without affording her a single glance and stopped beside Beatrice. Without asking, he possessively, yet gently, placed a warm, heavy hand on the bare skin of her lower back. A jolt of electricity shot up Beatrice's spine at the contact. My wife, Alexander said, his gaze sweeping over the sudden crowd of onlookers that had gathered, is the heart of the Montgomery Empire. Anyone who disrespects her, disrespects me. And I assure you, Hastings, if you ever speak of the Duchess in such a manner again, I will not simply buy your debts. I will buy your ancestral home, tear it down brick by brick, and salt the earth it stood upon. Do we understand one another? Hastings swallowed hard, gave a stiff, terrified bow, and fled the conservatory, Clara scurrying quickly behind him like a frightened mouse. Alexander turned to Beatrice, his expression softening just a fraction, pulling his hand away from her back as if he had burned her. Are you all right? Beatrice stared up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had expected him to be embarrassed by the gossip, to blame her for not managing society better. Instead, he had defended her honor with a ferocity she had never witnessed. I did not need your rescue, your grace, she managed to say, though her voice lacked its usual bite. I know, Alexander replied softly, offering his arm. But you are my wife, and I protect what is mine. Shall we show them how little their whispers matter? As she took his arm and they walked back into the glittering ballroom, Beatrice realized with a terrifying jolt that the monster she had sworn to hate was entirely different from the man walking beside her. That night, lying in her separate, lonely chambers, she touched the spot on her back where his hand had rested, feeling the ghost of his warmth. The impenetrable fortress of her hatred had sustained its first dangerous crack. Autumn brought a bitter, relentless chill to London, and with it, an outbreak of cholera in the impoverished East End districts where many of Alexander's dockworkers lived. The government turned a blind eye, but Alexander did not. To Beatrice's shock, the ruthless capitalist who supposedly cared only for ledgers poured thousands of pounds into securing clean water and medical supplies for the slums. He worked alongside the doctors, day and night, coming home at dawn, smelling of carbolic soap and exhaustion. Despite his orders for her to remain in the safety of Park Lane, Beatrice refused to sit idle. Drawing upon her aristocratic connections and formidable organizational skills, she turned the lower floors of their mansion into a staging ground for relief efforts, organizing the delivery of blankets, food, and clean linens. One evening, 3 weeks into the crisis, the heavy front doors slammed open. Alexander stumbled into the grand foyer, his coat soaked with freezing rain, his face entirely devoid of color. He made it to the bottom of the grand staircase before his knees buckled. "Alexander!" Beatrice screamed, dropping the ledger she was holding. She abandoned all propriety, rushing to him and catching his broad shoulders before his head could strike the marble floor. He was burning with a violent fever. For the next 4 days, the Duke of Ashbourne hovered between life and death. The finest physicians in London were summoned, but they offered little hope. Beatrice banished the nurses and took over his care entirely. She stayed by his bedside day and night, bathing his fever-scorched skin with cool water, forcing broth past his chapped lips, and listening to his delirium. In his fevered state, the cold, calculating Duke stripped away his armor. He muttered about the freezing winters of his childhood and poverty, the weight of the thousands of lives depending on his business, and, most shockingly, he whispered her name. "Beatrice," he choked out one night, grasping her hand with terrifying strength. "Too bright." I pulled her into the dark. Shouldn't have. Tears pricked her eyes as she stroked his damp hair back from his forehead. "Hush, Alexander! I am here. You are not in the dark." On the morning of the 5th day, the fever finally broke. Beatrice was asleep in a chair beside his bed, her head resting on the mattress, her fingers still intertwined with his. She woke to the sensation of a thumb gently stroking her knuckles. She bolted upright, her eyes locking onto Alexander's. He looked pale and ravaged, but his eyes were clear and startlingly lucid. "You stayed," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You are my husband," she replied, her voice trembling with a potent mix of exhaustion and an emotion she was terrified to name. "I told you I take my vows seriously." Alexander slowly reached up, his trembling hand cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized she shed. "You are magnificent, Beatrice." "I have spent my entire life building an empire of steel. And yet, you are the strongest thing I have ever known." The air in the room shifted, growing heavy and thick. The distance they had carefully maintained for nearly a year vanished in the space of a heartbeat. Beatrice leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. When he exerted a gentle pressure, pulling her downward, she did not resist. Their first kiss was not a polite, aristocratic pressing of lips. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted of tears and salvation. Alexander kissed her as if she were the oxygen he had been denied for a lifetime, and Beatrice responded with a fierce, consuming passion that shattered every vow she had made on their wedding day. She loved him. She loved the ruthless, broken, brilliant man who had bought her to save her family. For 2 glorious weeks during his recovery, the Park Lane mansion was a paradise. They spent hours talking, laughing, and discovering the profound depths of their unexpected connection. Alexander was tender, devoted, and fiercely passionate. Beatrice felt as though she had finally awakened from a long, cold sleep. But in the world of the London Ton, happiness is often the preamble to ruin. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Alexander had finally felt well enough to visit his study to review some urgent correspondence. Beatrice, wanting to surprise him with tea, pushed open the heavy oak door. She found Alexander standing by his desk, rigid as a statue, his face drained of all color. Across from him sat Lord Benedict Hastings, a triumphant, serpentine smile twisting his aristocratic features. Scattered across the mahogany desk were dozens of letters, their seals broken. "Ah, the devoted Duchess," Hastings sneered, bowing mockingly as Beatrice entered. "Impeccable timing. We were just discussing the origins of your romantic union." "Get out, Hastings," Alexander snarled, his voice vibrating with a lethal, barely contained violence. "Before I kill you where you stand." "Oh, I will leave," Hastings replied, picking up a specific letter and waving it like a victory flag. "But not before Lady Beatrice understands exactly who she has given her heart to. Tell her, Ashbourne. Or shall I?" "Alexander?" Beatrice asked, the tea tray rattling in her shaking hands. "What is he talking about?" Hastings turned to her, his eyes shining with pure malice. "Did you truly believe it was a coincidence that the great Duke of Ashbourne swooped in to save your father at the exact moment of his ruin? Did you think your father's debts just happened to fall into his lap?" Hastings dropped the letter onto the floor at Beatrice's feet. "Your husband didn't just buy your father's debt, your grace. He orchestrated it. He paid the gambling houses to extend your father limitless credit. He bribed the bank managers to call in the loans early. Alexander Montgomery manufactured your family's destruction specifically to force you onto the auction block." Beatrice stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt violently on its axis. She looked at Alexander, begging him with her eyes to deny it, to call Hastings a liar, to laugh it off as another pathetic society rumor. But Alexander didn't laugh. He couldn't meet her eyes. The great, powerful Duke of Ashbourne looked at the floor, his silence a deafening, catastrophic confession. The heavy mahogany clock in the corner of the study ticked loudly, each swing of its brass pendulum striking the oppressive silence like a judge's gavel. Lord Benedict Hastings had slipped out of the room, leaving the poisoned letter lying on the Persian rug at Beatrice's feet. Beatrice stared down at the parchment, Her eyes traced the rigid, undeniable signatures at the bottom, the crest of the Rothschild banking house, the stamp of the Bank of England's senior ledger clerk, and finally, the bold, slashing ink of Alexander Montgomery's signature. It was an authorization of funds, a massive transfer of capital designed specifically to buy up the Earl of Westmoreland's debts from all private lenders, followed by a legally binding instruction to demand immediate, ruinous repayment. The date on the letter was 6 months before her father's collapse. "Beatrice," Alexander said, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. It was the first time she had ever heard him sound unsure. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. "Do not touch me," she whispered. The words lacked venom. They were hollow, carved out by a betrayal so profound it had entirely emptied her of breath. She stepped back, her silk skirts rustling against the desk. "Tell me it is a forgery, Alexander. Tell me Hastings fabricated this to destroy us." Alexander let his hand fall to his side. The flickering gaslight cast long, unforgiving shadows across his sharp features. The mask of the ruthless industrialist, the one he had dropped during his fevered delirium, slammed back into place. But his eyes, those pale winter sea eyes, were entirely desolate. "It is not a forgery," he said, the baritone of his voice tight and ragged. Beatrice felt the floorboards tilt beneath her. She grabbed the edge of the tea tray to steady herself, the porcelain cups rattling violently. "You planned it. You deliberately drove my father to the edge of the abyss. You orchestrated the destruction of my family." "Your father was destroying his family perfectly well on his own, Beatrice," Alexander suddenly barked, a defensive anger surging to cover his guilt. "Lord Henry was pouring your inheritance onto the baccarat tables of Paris and the racetracks of Epsom. Within a year, he would have dragged you into the debtor's prison with him. He was borrowing from dangerous men from the East End who do not ask for repayment with polite letters, but with broken bones and forced labor. So you decided to be the monster who saved me from other monsters?" Beatrice cried, tears of pure, stinging fury finally spilling hot down her cheeks. "You bought my father's notes. You forced the bankruptcy. You bought me." "I secured you," Alexander corrected, taking another step forward, his jaw clenched. "I watched you for 2 seasons in London. Beatrice, I saw you managing that crumbling household, holding your head high while the ton whispered about your father's ruin. I knew you would never willingly marry a man like me, a man forged in the coal dust of the North, a man without a pedigree. If I had simply offered to pay his debts in exchange for your hand, your pride would have demanded you refuse. I had to leave you no choice. I had to make myself the only escape." "You did not offer an escape, Alexander!" she screamed, the sound tearing at her throat. "You built a cage and called it a sanctuary. Every word you spoke, every gentle touch, every vow we took at that altar, it was all built on a foundation of blackmail and deceit. You played God with my life. You made me believe I had fallen in love with a man who defended my honor, when, in truth, you are the architect of my humiliation." Alexander flinched, as if she had struck him across the face. "Beatrice, what happened between us these past weeks? That was real. My feelings for you are not a ledger entry. I love you." "Do not insult me by using that word," Beatrice spat, turning her back on him. She could not bear to look at him any longer. The illusion of the man she loved was dead, replaced by the calculating titan of industry the rest of the world had always warned her about. Love requires respect. Love requires truth. You possess neither. Without another word, Beatrice walked out of the study, leaving the tea tray rattling and the Duke of Ashbourne standing alone in the ruins of his own making. Within the hour, Beatrice's trunks were packed. She refused to take the carriage bearing the Ashbourne crest, instead sending her loyal maid, Martha, to hail a common hansom cab. As the rain began to fall in heavy, punishing sheets over London, Beatrice fled Park Lane. She sought refuge, not with her father, whom she could barely stomach seeing, knowing his weakness had precipitated this nightmare, but at the Belgrave Square residence of the Dowager Countess, Margaret of Harrington, her late mother's dearest friend, and a woman whose social standing was so unassailable that not even Alexander Montgomery could breach her doors. The Dowager Countess, a formidable woman who had survived 3 husbands and the reign of 3 monarchs, took Beatrice in without question. "Men of ambition are dangerous creatures, my dear," the Dowager Countess murmured that evening as they sat before a roaring fire, Beatrice shivering despite the thick cashmere shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "They view the world as a chessboard, and they view women as the queens they must capture to win the game." The separation of the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne became the scandal of the 1868 winter season. The Ton devoured the gossip with ravenous delight. Lord Benedict Hastings and Lady Clara Wentworth held court in every drawing room, spinning wild tales of Beatrice fleeing in terror from the northern savage. Alexander's reaction to the separation was terrifying. He did not pursue her. He did not send letters. Instead, he retreated entirely into the dark, merciless machinery of his empire. The London Stock Exchange trembled as Ashbourne unleashed a brutal corporate war, buying out competitors, liquidating assets, and crushing anyone who stood in his path. He worked 20 hours a day, a hollow, ruthless phantom haunted by the ghost of the woman he had driven away. His associates whispered that the Duke had lost his mind. He was making millions, but he looked like a man walking to the gallows. For Beatrice, the months in Belgravia were a blur of numb grief. She had sworn never to love him, and breaking that vow had broken her spirit. But in late January of 1869, the grief was suddenly compounded by a terrifying, undeniable physical reality. She summoned Dr. William Gull, one of London's most discreet and respected physicians. After a brief examination in her private chambers, the elderly doctor offered a sympathetic smile. "You are in excellent health, Your Grace," Dr. Gull said quietly, packing his leather bag. "And so is the child. I estimate you are nearly 4 months along." Beatrice sat entirely still on the edge of the bed, her hands instinctively moving to rest over her flat abdomen. A child. Alexander's child. The heir to the Montgomery Empire. "Doctor," Beatrice said, her voice shaking. "This must remain entirely confidential. No one must know. Especially not my husband." Dr. Gull nodded solemnly. "Patient confidentiality is absolute, Your Grace. But the Ton has eyes, and time will soon make the secret impossible to keep." Beatrice knew he was right. If Alexander discovered she was carrying his heir, he would use every legal and financial weapon at his disposal to drag her back to Park Lane. By the laws of England, a man owned his wife, and he most certainly owned his children. She had to leave London. She had to flee the country before she began to show. She began secretly writing to distant relatives in Florence, Italy, planning a midnight departure. But before the ink could dry on her letters, the past came violently knocking at the Dowager Countess's door. The bleak Tuesday afternoon sky over Belgravia perfectly mirrored the heavy, suffocating dread settling in Beatrice's chest. When the footman announced an urgent caller, she assumed it was her solicitor finalizing her secret passage to Italy. Instead, Lord Benedict Hastings stood in the center of the Dowager Countess's immaculate drawing room. He leaned casually upon a silver-tipped cane, a malicious, triumphant smirk twisting his aristocratic features. "Hastings," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a glacial chill as she froze in the doorway. "You have crossed a dangerous line stepping foot in this house. Get out before I summon the authorities. Now, Your Grace. Is that any way to greet the man who holds your entire future in his hands?" Hastings purred, taking a deliberate step forward. "You have played the tragic, wronged Duchess to perfection. But I have my ways of uncovering the truth. You have not attended a single social function in weeks. You summoned Dr. William Gull to these chambers in total secrecy. It does not require a brilliant mind to calculate that the estranged Duchess of Ashbourne is carrying a child." Beatrice's blood ran entirely cold, Her hands instinctively fluttered over her stomach, a protective gesture she immediately regretted as Hastings's smile widened into a predator's grimace. If you breathe a single word of this to the society papers, I will do far more than whisper to the papers, Beatrice. Hastings interrupted, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. Unless you agree to my terms. You will publicly declare that the child you carry is not Ashbourne's. You will declare it is mine. The humiliation will utterly destroy him. Parliament will strip him of his lucrative shipping contracts. The Rothschilds will pull their backing. He will be a laughingstock, ruined in the eyes of the crown. Do this, and I will marry you once Montgomery is forced to grant an annulment. You are insane, Beatrice breathed, stepping back, nauseated by his proximity. If you refuse, Hastings continued, his eyes gleaming with cruelty, I will tell the world you are a harlot who took lovers behind the Duke's back, and knowing Montgomery, he will legally rip that bastard child from your arms the very moment it draws its first breath. Beatrice felt the room tilt. Hastings was a monster of an entirely different breed, a vindictive parasite who fed on the destruction of others. I would rather die than claim you as the father of my child, she spat, her aristocratic pride flaring to life. We shall see, Hastings sneered, tipping his hat. You have 24 hours to decide. Before Hastings could turn toward the exit, the heavy oak doors of the drawing room violently burst open, the brass hinges screaming in protest as they slammed against the stone wall. Alexander stood in the doorway. He did not look like the impeccably tailored Duke of the London season. He looked like a northern warlord. His heavy wool coat was damp with melting snow. His cravat was discarded, and his pale winter-sea eyes burned with a lethal, terrifying fury. Behind him stood two massive, heavily scarred enforcers from the East India Docks, and beside them, Chief Inspector Aberline of Scotland Yard. Hastings stumbled backward, his silver-tipped cane clattering loudly to the parquet floor. Ashbourne, what is the meaning of this? You cannot simply barge into a private residence. I did not barge in. I purchased the mortgage to this entire estate an hour ago, Alexander stated, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the crystal chandelier above them. He walked slowly into the room, his eyes fixed on Hastings with the unwavering focus of an executioner. And as for you, Hastings, I warned you exactly what would happen if you ever threatened my wife again. Alexander snapped his fingers. One of the dock workers tossed a thick, leather-bound ledger onto the delicate tea table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. You thought you were clever, Alexander continued, stopping mere inches from the trembling lord. You believed you could embezzle from the Rothschild banking syndicate, falsify the shipping manifests on the HMS Dauntless, and utilize the stolen capital to finance your blackmail? You are an absolute amateur. Hastings's face drained of all color, his arrogant sneer collapsing into pure terror. How did you acquire those? I own the docks. I own the banks. I own the very air you breathe, Alexander whispered fiercely. Inspector Aberline is here to escort you to Newgate Prison for grand larceny and systemic fraud against the Crown. You will rot in a cell so deep and dark you will forget what the sun looks like. Take him. Hastings opened his mouth to protest, but the dock workers seized him by the arms, dragging him kicking and screaming from the drawing room, the inspector following closely behind. When the doors finally closed, the silence that fell over the room was absolute and deafening. Beatrice stood frozen by the fireplace, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Alexander remained in the center of the room, his broad chest heaving. Slowly, the terrifying energy he had just wielded drained away, leaving him looking hollowed out and completely exhausted. He did not close the distance between them. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick, legal envelope, sealed with heavy red wax. He placed it carefully on the tea table, right where the damning ledger had rested moments before. I did not come here to drag you back to Park Lane, Beatrice, Alexander said, his voice ragged. stripped entirely of its usual commanding resonance. My men intercepted Hastings's correspondence. I knew what he was planning to do to you. I could not allow it. Beatrice stared at the thick envelope. What is that? It is a petition of absolute annulment, Alexander replied softly, his gaze dropping to the floor. Signed by me, approved by the Archbishop, and finalized by the High Court. Included are the deeds to Rookwood Manor, the estate in Bath, and a private trust in your name that secures your financial independence forever. It cannot be touched by me, by your father, or by any man. Beatrice felt the breath completely leave her lungs. An annulment? I spent my entire life acquiring things, Alexander said, his eyes finally meeting hers, shining with an agonizing, unshed grief. I thought if I accumulated enough power, I could control the world. I thought I could control you. I bought your hand because I was a coward. I was a man who grew up with nothing, terrified that if I asked you to be mine freely, you would look at me and see only the northern dirt beneath my fingernails. So, I chained you to me. He took a shaky breath, stepping back toward the door, as if he did not trust himself to be in her orbit. But you were right. A cage is not a sanctuary. I broke every vow I made to you. I failed to protect you from myself. So now, I am giving you the one thing I stole. I am giving you your choice. You are free, Beatrice. You are safe. I will never trouble you again. He turned to the door, a titan brought to his knees by his own devastating realization of love. Alexander, wait. Beatrice walked slowly across the Persian rug. She picked up the heavy envelope. It contained her freedom. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, she gripped the parchment and tore it directly in half. Alexander spun around, his eyes widening in absolute shock as the torn halves fluttered to the floor. You promised me on our wedding day that you would never demand what I was not willing to give, Beatrice said, her voice filled with a fierce, undeniable strength. She stopped inches from his chest, reaching up to gently touch his jaw. You stole my choice. Once. Do not presume to make my choices for me again. I swore I would never love the man who blackmailed my family. And I don't. But the man standing before me, the man who just surrendered his entire empire to set me free, that man I love. Alexander let out a shattered breath. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest and burying his face in her neck, holding her as if she were his only lifeline. I do not deserve you, he wept against her skin. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. You will need to try particularly hard, Your Grace, Beatrice murmured, tears streaming down her own face as she smiled into his dark hair. Because in 5 months' time, you are going to be a father. Alexander froze. He looked down at her waist, his eyes wide with blinding, overwhelming joy, and dropped to his knees, right there, in the drawing room. The ruthless king of London wept at the feet of his wife, and as Beatrice held him, she knew their marriage, born of cold ink and debt, had finally been rewritten in unshakable, hard-won love. And so, the Duke who bought a bride ended up surrendering his entire world to keep her. The story of Alexander and Beatrice proves that while power and wealth can force a hand, only vulnerability and truth can capture a heart. From the glittering, treacherous ballrooms of Mayfair to a devastating betrayal and a beautiful redemption, their journey reminds us that sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to our deepest salvation. What did you think of the Duke's ultimate sacrifice? Did Beatrice forgive him too easily? Or did he truly earn his redemption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found yourself swept away by this Victorian romance, please hit that like button, share this story with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, sweeping tales of love, betrayal, and history.
Hi, my name is Primal Bond Living, the owner and manager of Primal Bond Living. After watching the video, Sold as a Bride of Convenience, She swore never to love. The Duke broke every vow. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the tension between guarded hearts and unexpected love. When someone has been hurt or forced into circumstances they never chose, trusting another person can feel almost impossible. That's what made the emotional journey so compelling to me. The gradual shift from protecting yourself to allowing someone else into your life. Do you think love can truly grow from a relationship that begins without trust or choice? And if you were in her position, would you have been willing to risk opening your heart again? Stories like this remind me that people are often stronger than they realize, and that healing sometimes begins when we least expect it. If this story stayed with you after the ending, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy historical romance stories filled with emotion, second chances, and unforgettable characters, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you'd like.